For my list today, there's nothing wrong with your eyes, but I am playing 50 points today, and there are 5 giants in this list. I am backing them up with Rattleshirt as the commander and putting him in the Followers of Bone unit. I'm bringing along Craster and Styre because they both work really well with giants. I think that a lot of Rattleshirt's cards can prove useful to the giants, although I'm not really convinced, and that's kind of why I'm playing this list. I'll be playing into the High Sparrow today, and there's just a lot of different Kingsguard in here just to try out the different ones. Uh, Jaime Lannister seems pretty good on the Mountainsmen. There's a lot of high output right there, and the low morale's kind of mitigated with the High Sparrow. And Boros Blance on the Warrior Sons just to try and get a few more defensive wounds out of there. I think the one that's going to surprise most people is Barristan Selmy on the Pyromancers. It gives them a lot of survivability, and they do benefit quite a bit from the morale buff, so they stick around a little bit longer and can burn a lot more. We're playing Game of Thrones for this one, and my giants are kind of positioned in ways to get onto objectives that I want. Also, I've got a giant way on the other side there because I know those Knights of Casterly Rock are going to try and start flanking, and I kind of want to stop that. But it seems like my opponent's kind of positioned all of his stuff in a way to try and deal with the giants as best as he can. I put up a lot of terrain that kind of funnels movement with the palisade and the spike wall, just to kind of make it a little bit tougher for my opponent to get around, where it's not going to be as difficult for me because I have a lot of small bases that can maneuver around fairly well. They're not fast, but they can at least squeak by little corners. This game is using like part of the 1.4 rules, so the middle objective is that static panic but worth 2 points objective, but we aren't using the contesting rules in this. This was filmed far before the 1.4 release kind of became live for real, so bear with me while we go through it here. For the first turn, my opponent ended up zapping Rattleshirt's unit, but they ended up not having to worry about it too much. And then I respond by taking the maneuver to get Rattleshirt up a little further and influence the Pyromancers to try and get some early wounds on them. I have a swift advance in my hand, so I decided to try and get that early because if I take the tactic zone away from my opponent, I'm not going to be really doing myself any favors with cards. And the maneuver is just more aggressive for me because I know that if I pass up the maneuver position, my opponent will take it from me instead. And I really need to be controlling the board and being aggressive on the board because I don't have a lot of cards in my deck that are going to help me out. And Rattleshirt can go get what I need when his stipulation happens. While we have a minute, the objectives that are out right now on Andy's side of the table at the very bottom is the shut off and attachment one, so I'm going to be gunning for that one real hard. On the top side of his table is Weakened and Vulnerable from Dance with Dragons. The one on my side on the bottom, or kind of more towards the middle by that spike wall, is the other Dance with Dragons one. It's Sundering and Vicious. And then the one on the top side of my table by the bog is Free Maneuver or Retreat at the end of the round. My next thing that happened, well, I guess for me, the next thing that happened for me, now that I'm caught up, is Craster ended up taking the coin. Again, I felt like getting rid of the Weakened token from the Giant was more important than getting a card, so I just ended up doing that, and I think that it'll end up working better for me in the end. So, my opponent's activating Preston Greenfield's unit, and this is something that I don't want to pick on him for, but this is something that you should be mindful of in your play. I think a lot of people end up lining their units up at the very front line, but if you've got a little bit of room to wiggle, just pivot them in the direction they want to go when you're deploying, so that when you take your march right away, you can do that without having to worry about having to worry about the pivot that happens at the front of it. So if he would have deployed the Lannister guard with that little pivoted angle, he could have just marched onto the objective and got it. Now, I think the objectives are a little too close to the deployment zones, so I apologize for that one. It was just a rule that I had overlooked while we were setting it up. No real excuses. I play this game mode so often that I should know better, but I think it was just one of those nights where I just got done with work and didn't think about it. So the objectives are a little close to the deployment zones for this one. But you can kind of see with the way I've been activating my giants, I want to save Rattleshirt's unit for last. Well, at least I wanted to, because I figured the pyromancers might get a little bit more aggressive, and I might be able to get off a good swift advance into a charge on them. But since they only maneuvered up slightly towards that like little gap between the palisade and the spike wall, I'm not so inclined to do that anymore because they're playing really defensive. And the way my opponent's objectives are lined up, again, illegally lined up, but it is what it is. Um, they he's kind of forced to play back further, and I'm more forced to come towards the middle. The Giants don't mind it so much, especially with all this terrain in the middle. My two pieces that I had laid down were the palisade and the spike wall. I think that palisades in the middle of the table are kind of where they want to be now. It means that if your opponent wants to try and take those like free activations with dogs to kill them, they're going to end up costing them victory points if they do that. And it does take a little bit of effort to get rid of them. I mean, you can march straight up to them and then take the swords and smash it down. But if it's in the direct middle, that you kind of have to wait till turn 2 to do that, and the amount of NCUs you have to activate to do that for free is going to be a little rough. So I think that the palisade's good in the middle. But you can kind of see my giants lining up to make this defensive line in the middle of the table where wherever they need to go, they are able to get to without too much of a problem. With the Knights of Casterly Rock, I do want to leverage this bog on the side here. Bogs are really great pieces of terrain. I think that they're probably underutilized. They take up a little bit more space than corpse piles if you're using the ones from the box, right? And they just don't affect your morale, which for me I don't care so much about because I'm a giant. You could give me -1 to my morale and it wouldn't matter. But for someone like Lannister or neutrals, well, I guess I just named two factions that like having negative panic tests. But if you're trying to just like not worry about putting out, you want to hinder your opponent from getting to you, but don't want to have to worry about the penalties for the corpse pile. This is a good way to try and mess with your opponent's movement and just kind of chunk them up or direct traffic. So you can kind of see already with the way that the terrain is set up, I'm directing my opponent's moves. And in wargaming, I think that the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to trying to, win over your opponent is trying to force their decision making. And with the way this terrain is laid out, my opponent only has a couple vectors to really come at me from without taking some significant penalties for it. So I'm kind of already forcing my opponent to go in certain directions with him having all big infantry bases, and I have all these small little bases, the solo bases, so I can maneuver around the table pretty well. They're not fast, but they can squeak through all these little nooks and crannies and not have to worry about it so much. In addition, since some of the terrain's placed on the opposite side of the objectives, or the more like happy for me side of the objectives, I can also leverage that terrain to make sure that my opponent needs to come through it to get at me. That palisade's going to be hard for him to negotiate. He's going to have a difficult time getting around the bog. He kind of has to go through it or take the long way around, which lets me set up for later. So use that terrain to your advantage and don't just pop out trees and corpse piles one after another. You're really losing out on a lot of benefits by just doing that kind of like counter deploy for terrain. There's a big benefit to putting this kind of stuff on the table. For the top of round 2, again, I want to make sure that I can get the swift advance off if the opportunity presents itself. So I've decided to take the maneuver position with Craster right away to get a giant up. I don't know why I just said that. Well, never mind, I did, because I want swift advance to give me the benefits for having the maneuver zone. And what I really should have done here is I moved that middle giant up, but where he was, he could have just marched onto that objective. I don't think I'm really worried about counter deploying for a charge or anything like that. What I really should have done is move this bottom giant with that maneuver so that he could get closer to getting into those Lannister guard, because shutting off Rattleshirt is really going to harsh my chill on this one. I think it's been like the last like 9 games out of 10 that I've played with Rattleshirt where my opponents shut him down, and it really is not a good place for him because I don't utilize the tactics zone much with this list, and or I use it when I need to, but for the most part, I don't care about vulnerable. I don't usually care too much about weakened or panicked. So the token isn't really super beneficial for me. Like putting a weakened token out can be really nice sometimes, but for the most part, the cards aren't that big of a deal for me. I'm usually discarding them every round anyways until I find ones that are relevant to me. Um, so you can see that my opponent got rid of one of the Rattleshirt cards. I think this is the one where defense saves of 6 end up doing a wound to the opponent, and he let me keep Endless Horde. So that was a Tyrion order. So again, with the tactics position, I don't feel like I need it. So I'm really trying to play my game on the table since it's not going to be played in my tactics hand so much. And I do really need to get rid of the Lannister guard that are going to take that objective on the bottom of the screen because there's a lot of bonuses that Rattleshirt can provide to these giants with his cards. So if I don't get that engine running, I'm really losing out on some benefits. But again, I've kind of castled myself the way I want to, or not castled up so much. I think more so Andy's castled up than I have. But I've kind of set my defensive line really far up the table, so it's almost like I'm being really aggressive on the scenario because my opponent is not being so aggressive on coming into me. I think that a lot of people get a little bit timid around giants because they have such a high potential to be an annoyance. They're hard to get rid of. They automatically do their wounds regardless of what your save is, and their morale's really good. So they're kind of like the exact opposite of a raider unit. Their issues, of course, are that you can't really buff their output at all except for with Styre. And when they go down, it's a really big loss on your part. So I have to apologize. I've gotten a lot better with my camera since this game because I think I've filmed maybe 3 or 4 games by now with this. But I ended up pausing it because I had left a extension cord at home, and when I did that, I shifted the angle of the camera. Thankfully, there's nothing that's out of view. It just kind of makes it look really wonky. So I apologize for that. Just know that it's not going to be so much an issue in the future, but bear with me while you're kind of looking at the table all crooked. So I've kind of got my giant ready to, or on the bottom, you can tell like it's really telegraphed where he's going. I don't want my opponent to be shutting off Rattleshirt, which he is right now. So he's all about getting into the Lannister guard's business. And it's tough too because these guys don't move very fast, so it's not beneficial. It's not the best case scenario for a giant having to hoof it all the way across the table, which again is why it was probably a bad idea to target that other giant in the middle with the maneuver when I could have done it with the one on the side. So the Warrior's Sons move up, and they're just kind of towing that objective on the back end. Again, we aren't using the 1.4 rules for claiming objectives, so you can still kind of tow them in order to, or just stick your toe onto them in order to make sure that you're capturing them. So bear with me again. I should have just got these out sooner instead of waiting for the new game mode to release, but we'll fix that soon enough, or change it. So the Pyromancers look like they're activating now, and I think they're kind of like in this wibbly world of they don't know quite what to do because they can kind of see that the giant on the side is really just like that's his job. Like I said, I telegraphed to my opponent, this is where this giant is going. There's no shenanigans, no tricks. My giant is just making a beeline for those Lannister guard. So he's got to try and choose where he wants them to be for the subsequent turns. And I think he decides to march them, but not very far again. He's really trying to cover this open area in the middle between the palisade and the spike wall. The only real problem with this is that the objectives are on the other side of it, so I don't really care too much that they're there. So I kind of jumped the gun on some things here. So I activated Rattleshirt's unit. My opponent decided to do a paid mutiny. I failed the panic check because he does own that coin. I took the 3 wounds, and Rattleshirt is now super turned off. And I wanted to swift advance them, but then my opponent counterplotted the swift advance. So because I figured with swift advance I could get them far enough up to where I could get that charge on those pyromancers. But my opponent's done a good job of dashing that, so I try to visualize the distance. I know I have the sticks and pre-measurings allowed, but I visualize the 8 inches for the pyromancers and figure, this is about where I think that I can be out of range and not have to worry about it. And after my opponent measured, it looks like I did a decent job of keeping myself out of range. He does have 1 NCU left that can take the combat zone and cause them to shoot, so I just had to be mindful of that. And I think that Rattleshirt's, beat up from that paid mutiny, but at least he's surviving back there on that back objective. So unfortunately, it looks like Steyer's influence isn't really going to help me. It's only going to hurt me here. But those are the risks you take when you decide to get a little greedy or telegraph what you're doing. Because I think with the giant, when I telegraph that, there's not a lot he can do about it. The pyromancers are too far to be effective, and the Lannister guard are just like, I guess I'll just sit here. But when I put Steyer on the Rattleshirt unit, or the followers of Bone, or the Bone Lord's Chosen, it's almost like I'm telling my opponent, I plan to get these engaged with you this turn, so do not let me do that. So he kept them far back, and when the counterplot came down, he was like, yep, I need to stop this or else I'm going to get that charge. So good on him for kind of seeing what I was working with here. But now I'm trying to figure out where I want to move things or how I want to move them, because I got Knights of Casterly Rock coming up at me. But I also want to try and make sure that I can get the giant on the objective. So I just decided to let him tow it also. I think my moving was a little sloppy there, but pivoting on solo bases, it always looks like when you're doing it by hand that you can't fail, but then when you actually see it happen, it's like, that probably wasn't correct. But regardless, with the 5-inch move, I could have gotten to this position anyways. So now the pyromancers find out that they are in range to shoot my giant, which is a bummer, but I needed to get on this objective. So I think I can't remember what we were confirming in terms of questions or anything that my opponent had on the pyromancers. I think it was more so maybe like he was asking if the shift stops him from going 2 inches, but in my interpretation of the rules, when you shift, it's not considered a move. It seems like the game considers it a placement, and I know that the game doesn't seem to make a different or definition between shifting being a placement and moving being like the move or whatever. But for my interpretation, I figure that it doesn't take away any distance from being on corpse piles, and they end up shooting that giant and doing a couple wounds, which I'm not too worried about. I'm fine with him being there, especially since I have Craster kind of waiting to heal him up. But the same thing with trappers. Like if someone shifted in melee or shifted to shoot, I wouldn't trigger my trappers because I don't consider that a move. It'll be interesting to see if there's a ruling out there on that one or if it'll happen anytime in the future. But at current, I don't feel like shifting is cause for triggering move or move penalties. I think it's pretty well understood though too, because there's people that are shifting 3 inches with pip on units when you're playing Dance with Dragons and have an egg. So I don't think that I'm too outside of the whatever the normative of the community is right now. So moving on to turn 3, Rattleshirt takes a hit but does block it, which is nice. I like having that 4+ save in this unit. A lot of points for it, but it's still a decent save on the unit. He ends up, I think we move the weakened and the vulnerable to another giant, but this is where now you can see after I've made that one maneuver, I'm really up close and personal with these Lannister guard, and I've moved back enough to where if my opponent were to charge me, he would have to leave that objective, but it's not too far that I can't make that on a really reasonable roll. But you can see we did switch the vulnerable and weakened from the middle giant to the second giant in that line, second going from the middle to the top. Um, but yeah, my giants have kind of really clustered up here because the Warrior's Sons and the Knights of Casterly Rock are probably the two more scary units for me. Um, and I almost would say the Mountains Men are probably more scary, but since the Palisades right there, I'm not too worried about them getting to me. My opponent's going to have to do a lot of work to do that, and I could probably deny the charge if he removes the Palisade. So trying to do something with the Knights and Warrior Sons, or just trying to absorb them, is probably going to be more beneficial for me. And now you can see my opponent's kind of yo-yoed out the Pyromancers to try and stop me from getting a charge in there with Rattleshirt. Which is for me right now is fine because I'm happy just existing on this objective. I would have liked to have gotten in there to take out those Pyromancers because I think Rattleshirt's unit could do a ton of work to them even with Barristan Selmy. But now I can just kind of sit back here and relax. But he did do that with the maneuver zone instead of with the actual model. I have a really tough choice here. Well, tough is a weird word. I have the option to either heal back heal back Rattleshirt's unit to full, or I can take the less efficient play and heal the giant up by 2. So I opt to heal up the giant, I think, at the end of this discussion that we have. Just because if my opponent does decide to get rid of that Palisade, he'll open himself up to a charge from that middle giant, and I can deal with going into them first. He does try to Varys the healing on the giant, so I think that was another thing we are kind of debating. And the Varys thing didn't go off, so the giant's back up to full health. Styre came down on this lower giant because I do want to make sure that I can take out as many Lannister guard as I can. They have a low morale, well, middle of the road morale, which to me feels low. So I don't think I'm too worried about not being able to. I just want to make sure they get cleared off that thing because I want Rattleshirt back up and at him. But Varys does take a couple more bodies out from him, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. So then Craster naturally comes down and heals him. And I do this pretty strategically. I take the combat zone because I don't want to give my opponent the opportunity or option to take out the Palisade for free. Because if he does that, then he still gets to keep the activation. So at least now I've got it to where he'll have to lose something in terms of activations in order to get rid of that Palisade, and I'm perfectly fine just sticking a giant behind the Palisade and just accumulating points. I end up showing my opponent probably something like Endless Horde and Group Assault. Like their Endless Horde is nice, but I have 2 other cards in my hand that I really don't, or 1 other card in my hand that I really don't want to get rid of. I think it was the Rattleshirt upgrade that gives you 2 extra dice when you attack. But he decides to so now I've got a line of giants that are just vulnerable everywhere, which is not really where they want to be. So I'm not really happy with how their survivability is looking. But I decide that my next order of business is to try and charge this giant into the Lannister guard. So I keep pivoting to see if I can make this a rolling a 1 charge. And it looked really tight there, but I end up pivoting him in a way to where I can get that 6-inch widget to connect to the Lannister guard. So it means that I'll need anything but a 1 to get, or anything to get there, even a 1. I do roll a 2, so all the fanfare was not super worth anything. But now we're rolling Styre damage to do 3, and then the giant damage does 4. So that was. I know that this is just gonna only add fuel to the fire of giants are broken thing, but Styre and the giant together getting that many wounds to come across is super duper rare. It's like I think a 16 or between 12 and 16% chance that that happens. You can check my math if you want, but I'm not the greatest mathematician in the universe. It might even be just a little bit lower than that, like anywhere between 16 and 8%, I think is probably where I want to land that one. But they do pass their morale, and my Lannister supremacy check ended up rolling a 3, so I do fail by 1, which means that I do take a wound, which is unfortunate. But it's still fortunate, I guess, because it means that I have the opportunity next turn to probably take out the whole unit in one swing. But again, it's not going to be super duper. It's not a guaranteed thing. But having one wound on one giant that's engaged with a unit of second rank Lannister guard is not really bothering me. I don't expect them to do a ton of damage back to me. I expect a little bit, but just not a lot. And I think I'm far enough away from those pyromancers to where they really can't get to me. And with me having the start of next turn, I think I'll be able to do a lot of work to get rid of those Lannister guard for very little investment and not have to worry about being under threat from the pyromancers. But my opponent's kind of in this weird position because they've not wasted their turns, but they definitely have, like, turn 2, they didn't just get up as far enough on the board as I think they really should have come. So there's it's taking them a little while to get to my line, and as long as I'm sitting here on these objectives, I'm scoring 4 points since I've got that middle one too. So I really think the Palisades shutting down a lot of my opponent's aggression, and the timid nature of the Knights of Casterly Rock are also kind of hurting him a little bit too, because I have to cross that bog too, and for me it's a little bit more difficult since I don't have that cavalry move in the beginning to kind of kick it off. So we'll see what happens with these knights. I think these are the ones that he's activating. And since I've put my giants behind the bog, it's kind of hard for him to figure out where to go. So we, from my perspective, when we ended up trying to do the charge on this one, I think we forgot, or we didn't forget. It's just that I didn't do the hindering roll on the Casterly Rock, or the Knights of Casterly Rock charge. So that's a mistake on my part, but I don't know what I was thinking at the moment because they were going through it, or maybe they weren't, or maybe they pivoted. No, I think they were going through it anyways, but the rerolls do end up hurting me quite a bit because he ended up throwing 2 6s on the 2 misses. So there's a chance that there could have been a disordered charge in that one, but I'm fine with taking this on the chin. For saves, I only pick up 2 5s, but that means that I end up only taking 4 wounds. So my opponent uses the vulnerable order or vulnerable token to make me re-roll the 2 that I passed. Unfortunately, I don't make it on this one, so 1 giant goes down, getting my opponent a point. So the first giant of the game goes down. It's not a big deal. At 50 points, I've got 5 of them, so it's not really a big problem. As long as the Knights of Casterly Rock aren't going after the one on the objective, I'm happy about that. I also think at this point I haven't activated any of those other giants, so I've got the opportunity to turn them around now. The 2 giants back there do have a couple vulnerable tokens on them, so I'm more interested in trying to get the charge before they get charged. The NCU board's pretty full, and I know that the throne is coming back to me on the next turn. So unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to live the dream of having Styre take the free attack and put him on that giant that's engaged with the Lannister guard on the bottom of the screen. Instead, I'll have to probably charge those Knights of Casterly Rock to stop them before they become a problem. But I do end up pulling the Jolly Green Giant off the table since I have that other painted one there, and it's just, I had it there, so I might as well do it. I need to apologize for the shifts in the screen again. Like, I'm really getting used to trying to break these things up with the filming setup that I've got. Plus, when I'm remote, I can only do so much with it. So I think that should be the last one at least. But in terms of kind of seeing where the table's sitting at, I think that my opponent's got some really difficult choices to make because he hasn't really committed to the fight just yet. And I'm not going to send Rattleshirt up there either because he's on this objective. Now, I do stick him out a little bit just to kind of entice my opponent a little because I'd want either the Mountainsmen or the Pyromancers to come out. Now, I didn't really think that I'd be giving up a charge on Rattleshirt's unit by putting them there. I figured the Palisade would give me more protection in that regard, but I think the way that my opponent's got to pivot on this one is going to make it really difficult for him to charge off. So we're going through the motions of like, can you actually pivot and miss the Palisade? And I'm using my horizontal laser. I think Broken Egg Games is where I get these from. And I know that they're a hot commodity with them, so there was a period of time, I think it was a year or so, where they didn't have any for whatever reason, and just got a restock maybe a couple months ago, so I think there's a chance that they still might be there. I think horizontal lasers are really valuable in this game. You can kind of see things without having to do stuff like this. It just kind of makes things a little quicker. But we do figure that my opponent can get there on, I think it was a 5. If I'm not mistaken, and he won't have to go through the spike pit at all. So it's not impossible, but the thing is at this point, since he's played so far back and so reserved with his units, he has to make these really difficult choices now because if he doesn't get into this game, I'm going to start outscoring him really fast, and I'm able to at this point just back the Giants away from anything that he has that's going to put some aggressive pressure on me, and just deal with the Knights of Casterly Rock. Like, I could easily just put 2 Giants on those Knights and fight that out while the Warrior Sons, they either stay on their objective and score points, or they come off their objective and you're not losing points, but then they've got to kind of make the slog up the table to get to those other Giants, and that Palisade still isn't going to make that any easier on them. It's a really tough position. This is it's kind of hard in Game of Thrones when you don't have, or when you have your points kind of spread out to a lot of elite units. Like, you want to try and get and I think I have to back up a little bit here. I really do think that the placement of the objectives is really screwing with my opponent. I didn't intend for those things to go back there, but you can kind of see why it's good to have objectives in the middle and why that rule exists, because my opponent's pretty set up in the back now and not committing to the middle of the table at all, and doesn't have the pieces to hold those back objectives, so it's kind of hurting him a little bit. So he decides to go for that charge and comes up 1 short. I think he ended up rolling a 4 on this one. So they don't make it, and a panic check ends up taking out a decent amount of Mountains men too. It's just the worst thing that could happen happened. That failed the charge, get close enough to the Giant for him to be able to get in and still stay on the objective, and lose a bunch of guys to panic. So this is just not the best thing in the universe. So I think in 1.4, the scenario update of 1.4, this charge for the Giant gets a little bit more like debatable, because I don't want to come off the objective, but since we're in the previous edition of games here, or the game modes, it doesn't matter so much. But now I think the Pyromancers are kind of seeing the writing on the wall with the Lannister Guard, knowing that they're not going to exist, and or not exist for much longer, right? And gets the Pyromancers set up in a way to where they can start shooting down that Giant that's in the corner. And one of the fun things about Styre on Giants is the if you roll a 1 or a 2, or I mean a 1 on your D3 for hits, you don't even have to take the save because that's just how that works. So that's a fun little piece if you haven't already kind of sussed that out in your own Giant play. But I think to play a mass Giant list properly, you just have to really play the movement game more so than trying to jam them up. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm using the pieces on the table and the objectives to beat my opponent on this one, and not trying to get crazy with, oh, I can't wait to get these Giants into this charge or something. They're being a little bit more reserved and just kind of playing the game on their own terms, because my opponent, like I said, now has to come get me. So we're going to turn 4. I enter this turn with 8 victory points, and that means my opponent's got to do quite a bit to shake some of my guys off objectives, because I think he's sitting at 5 right now. I'm pretty sure it's 5 points. So I'm a lot closer to closing the game out than he is. I end up, like I said, I have to charge the Knights because I can't let them charge me. And I go in with the non-weakened one, and that ends up netting me 4 wounds on the Knights. And they don't lose any on the panic check. They end up passing it real well. I don't have any problems with the Giant at all either. So I know I'm giving up some prime spaces on that NCU board, but I do point out to my opponent, because he's kind of looking around the table trying to figure out what he needs to do next. And then I had expressed to him that if I take that sword zone or the combat zone, you're going to get a bunch of wounds thrown at you for it. So I was just trying to give him a heads up of what was going on. But the pyromancers seem like they're in a space where they can shoot my Giant, and it's a tough one, I think, because he'd have to take a panic check too for it. Either that or maybe he wasn't in range. I couldn't quite tell by what we had put down, but the Mountains Men decide to attack into a vulnerable Giant, and that's not a bad deal, especially since Jamie is in there and giving them that extra rank, so it's like they're attacking with full strength. And my Giant is taken a few wounds, but after rolling again, he ends up taking 4 wounds total. So he had some really he had a real bad time with what ended up going on there. But he does end up making that panic check, so he doesn't have to worry about losing wounds. So you can tell from my opponent's reaction that when I had attacked back with that Giant that I rolled a 1. And I think he was reaching for the weakened token, trying to use it, but then I told him, no, I missed. Don't worry about it. Because I think people are so used to Giants missing, or Giants hitting, that when they miss, it's like it's otherworldly to them. So I think this is just the Mountains Men activating to get the chance that they have to try and take out this Giant. So he uses Mercy of the Mother to try and heal them back up, and doesn't pass the morale test. And then my Giant ends up passing all of his saves but 1. So maybe he didn't take 4 wounds. It looks like he took 2 or 3. But the Giant's not dead just yet, so he's still being able to do his job there. Again, if this were the 1.4 for contesting, currently he's not contesting the Giant because he's got 2 wounds left with 2 ranks. But again, I think I'm only saying that because I think people worry about the Giants and their contesting capacity. But there were some really unfortunate things that went on in that middle zone to have the Giant kind of get to the position that it's in. So I think my Giant at the bottom of the screen ends up killing the Lannister guard. And it's funny how that happened because he rolled a 3, so that giant's just been on fire. And then +1 makes it 4, and then since the Lannister supremacy gave him a wound, the last one ended up killing the Lannister guard, so that was kind of nice for him. But then Lannister pays his debts comes out, and that ends up putting vulnerable and panic on the relevant units. But I've got I think that puts me up to 9 points now, so I think at the end of this turn it's going to be really difficult for my opponent to kind of bounce back on this one, because the Knights of Casterly Rock aren't really going to get much of anywhere. Like, they're going to be they're going to be stuck in that giant unit for a while, and I think the Warrior Sons need like a Hail Mary, like rolling double sixes to make the charge on the giant that's engaging them. So it's a rough battle. I think right at this point we're just trying to have him like get what he can in terms of trying to get me off objectives or get points somehow to try and at least kind of bring the victory points closer together. So the Pyromancers decide to charge because they are better charging than they are shooting. And the interaction with Giants and Pyromancers is interesting because you can't block the wounds, but it still takes 2 wounds to deal 1 to you. So on this one, the best that the Pyromancers can do is 3 wounds, which they do. But now I've just got a panic check to do, and it's at -2, so I'm not super happy about that one because it's in the realm of failing still. Like, you're not guaranteed. Like, that 3 is really hard to mess up on, but I do make it on a 9, so my giant is surviving with 1 wound up there. So in this case, for the new scenario, that would be my opponent would be contesting that objective. So there's that. But the Rattleshirt's unit, the Bone Lord's Chosen, end up charging the Mountains Men on the side, and they get onto that spike wall. But I was hoping that it wouldn't. Well, I guess there's no way that it couldn't take a rank from them. But they're still not terrible in combat. They end up hitting with everything, and my opponent ends up failing a number of saves. I think it was 4 total, and now he's got a panic at -1, and I decide to try and put one of Rattleshirt's cards on him. I think this is the one where he gets to have a couple swings, but after the Mountain Men went down, we called it at that point. It seemed like it was a pretty set victory on my part, but look forward to more giant lists, and I know I've got another High Sparrow game coming soon. He's kind of been pretty popular around here, so we're looking at playing a little bit more of him to kind of showcase a few more units.